So how are you doing today? So this one unusual thing about this talk is that I proposed this talk when I was independent, just like a lot of you, and I was a speaker and a consultant and all those things. And then I went to work for Microsoft. So I have a new bio. I just checked this. Come on, there we go. I have a new bio, and it says I work at Microsoft. So actually now it's great fun because the work I'm talking about today is actually on the team that I work with. So the PM team I work with handles .NET standard. Somebody else is mostly responsible because it's crazy hard sometimes. So when you look into the .NET future, how do you feel? It's kind of like that. Huh? What are you doing? So I'm hoping that I can do a few things today, including clarify a little bit about what's going on. Not much. I'll just give you kind of a little teaspoon of that. And then talk about exactly what you can do to take your applications forward into the next generation of your apps running on the next generation of what's going on from Microsoft. So I think we're in a fantastic space, but I think that it's still hard to see. I've worked a little harder figuring out what was going on. That's why I proposed the talk before I joined Microsoft. And I had to. If you didn't start unraveling the onion, you couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. So if you're a little bit confused, I totally get it. All right, so there's a couple of reasons. How many of you are feeling a little bit of whiplash from the last 3 years watching Microsoft? Nobody? You're all feeling great, right? Nobody's got whiplash. Whew, what was that? Project.json, what went flying by there? I want to talk about that for just a minute. I want to be really direct about this because I believe there are two very clear reasons that we've had this whiplash thing going on. And one of which is that Microsoft has changed course on a few things. So, the next version .NET course can be tiny, little, light, tiny thing. Oh, no, it's not. It's going to be Project.json. Oh, no, it's not. And so there's been a little bit of that going on. And it's been because of feedback. It's because Microsoft is listening. They're not saying, we know what's best. And that's really lucky because I think that some of the directions that they went would not have been as successful as the direction we actually are going. They might have worked, but I think the direction we're headed for right now is actually extremely exciting and puts .NET in a position, as soon as this story is understood, to actually be the premier development platform again, which is what I want as somebody who's invested for a long time in .NET. And of course now I also want, because I'm a Microsoft employee, but I wanted that long before I was a Microsoft employee. This is where my investment is. And I'm invested there because I love C#, I love strong type languages, I love having a big, beautiful framework backing me up so I don't have to go looking for whatever little piece of functionality I need. I know the first place to look. The other reason is you get to watch the sausage. That's what open source means. So Microsoft is this big company that works together, and all of a sudden it's in the wild, and you can watch issues, and you can say, well, this guy, he changes his mind easily. He's really opinionated, but he'll listen to people. And sometimes people are having to argue with this other person, and whether they're in the community or whether they're at Microsoft, you see all of that. And so this tacking has been from feedback, and you've seen it all. And so right now, if you have a little bit of whiplash and you're a little bit, what was all this? I totally get it. And I totally think for the central features that we are ready to go beyond that. Is Microsoft done taking feedback? Are there areas that might have a little bit of rethinking? Right now we have people giving input by using Dapper that they're a little uncomfortable with how much any framework does behind the scene. The fact people are interested in Dapper is a piece of feedback. Is Indie Framework going to change? I have no idea. Will it change in a big way and break? Probably not. But we have areas that there's feedback that's okay, there's other things going on in the community that are also interesting. And Microsoft's not going to stop listening to that. But I do think that the craziness of the last few years is done and behind us. Okay, no more sausage making. Now I get a chance to work with this great guy. He's very brilliant and very kind and very funny. And Emo is made a great series of videos on YouTube. And I know when you come to a conference like this, you go, wow, that was a lot of stuff. So you can go back and watch Emo's videos. I also appreciate the fact that I took several of my slides directly from Emo. So why this .NET Standard thing at all? Why is there something called .NET Standard? What's the point? Where are we going? So this is the world as we used to know it. The words today and tomorrow are a little messed up on the slide because I just grabbed an older set. So are you going to turn on? My laser's broken. All right. So there was a base class library for every single platform. So the Xamarin, or the Mono, or the .NET Core, or UWP, or Phone, or Silverlight, each one had its own base class library. And they were a little bit different. Each one, sometimes they just didn't have a set of features. Sometimes they had those features a little bit different because at that point, every base class library said, forget the rest of the world. I just want to be greatest for my customers in my space. Well, most of you don't have a single pillar here. Most of you at least think about things beyond just a single pillar. If you do just think about .NET Framework, then you still think about the future of .NET, even if you're not today working except in one pillar. So let's take that and fix that. It was difficult for you, difficult to reuse your code, and difficult for Microsoft to implement because there were so many different BCLs. Let's just have one. I'll talk in a minute about how this can actually work, because if you're going, yeah, that sounds really hard. It's not as hard as you might expect, and I'll talk about how that actually is implemented. So now you can reuse your skills. When you learn how to use a particular feature in one vertical, and you're working against .NET Standard, that's going to be the same somewhere else. You can reuse your code, you can reuse your skills, and Microsoft can look at a big picture of innovation and move forward as kind of one path instead of this platform and that platform and this other platform. And hopefully we're going to get more platforms. We may come along and find something, maybe something in HoloLens, because Lauren just gave a great talk. Maybe something there that actually is better. We also have Unity. I forgot Unity is a platform. So .NET Standard is a reference. It's a NuGet package. It's also a reference assembly. The next slide says that. It's a specification. The specification means like HTML5. It's a set of rules. If somebody follows those rules, they implement the specification. So just like a browser might say, hey, we support HTML5. A platform can say, hey, we support .NET Standard 1.1 or 2.0 or a particular standard. You get it as a NuGet package or in your version of Visual Studio. It's also with the .NET SDK. Do I have anybody who worked primarily at in Visual Studio Code or at the command line? Few people? You're all Visual Studio, hardcore Visual Studio users? That's great. It's a great tool. But isn't it nice to know that if somebody came along and said, we're going to also do this other platform, Linux or something, you can just jump. And it's not that hard. It's actually, it's a little bit disconcerting when you're used to pushing buttons to be typing commands, but it's not too big of a jump. So it's a standard and it's a document, and it's written in code. And what that means is that it's a reference assembly. I thought I had that here. Somewhere I've got that it's a reference assembly. But a reference assembly is an empty assembly. So a reference assembly in .NET Standard DLL, if you target .NET Standard, the DLL, the .NET Standard DLL that you're targeting is completely empty. Just imagine every single method, property, everything is just open curly, close curly. And that's pretty much what you've got. That gives you everything you need to build. So you can build against that, and your application knows how to talk to .NET Standard. That's the point of the .NET Standard, reference assembly DLL. Now, when you go onto a particular platform, let's say you go and you run, just like normal, you're running on a .NET full framework. Let's say you're on 4.6.1. So you're running on .NET Framework 4.6.1. 4.6.1 claims it implements .NET Standard 2.0. You with me on all these numbers? It's a little bit hard to follow the bouncing ball. So .NET Standard 4.61 is a platform. It runs on Windows. It claims to implement .NET Standard 2.0, which means it needs to implement a .NET Standard DLL to replace that reference assembly that does the right thing. Does the right thing is whatever it means on that platform. .NET has some tools to use for that, binding redirects, type forwarding, type unification. These are in .NET. The idea of .NET includes these. Those are the tools that are used. But all you care about is that we start and we build against one .NET standard DLL, and there's a matching one we can drop into for .NET 4.61, another one we can drop into for .NET Core, another one for Xamarin, another one for anything else that supports .NET Standard. Does that make sense? Technically, you believe it can happen. And that's, I don't like the fact that this slide looks like magic. I'm going, okay, really? How does that work? They're different platforms. And this is how it works, is that when we say .NET Standard, one BCL to rule them all, that's in the sense of the reference assembly. It's in the sense of the rules, not in the sense of the actual implementation, which is, of course, different for each of the platforms, because what it means to write to a console is a different call to the underlying operating system on Linux versus Windows. With me on all this? Great. Okay, so the way we're going to run this talk is I'm going to talk about some of the basics so you understand enough to believe it works. And that's really the piece I want you to have. None of you are going to be implementing unless you go to work for somebody who's doing a new platform, which is highly unlikely. You're not going to be creating a .NET Standard DLL, but I want you to believe it works. Then we're going to talk about how you're going to take your application through a process that'll get you able to run on whatever comes at it in the future in the .NET world. So that's the progression of the talk. Okay, so it's a standard, it's a document, it's written in code. There's 32,000 APIs. If they wrote it in a Word document, does anybody think they could implement it correctly? I mean, that'd be crazy. Who could do that? So instead, what they do is they implement it. I mean, it's defined as a reference assembly. You can look at that reference assembly. And it drives a lot of tools, some of which we'll look at. Okay, so at this point, there's often a question in people's minds that say, but you said this was going to work with PCL. Portable class libraries, that's the way this was all going to work. Well, portable class libraries were done at a time when there really wasn't the capacity inside Microsoft. There wasn't the commitment to do something as big and broad as .NET Standard. .NET Standard was harder to do than PCLs. PCLs were not easy, but the idea behind a PCL is that each platform continues to do what it does. So each platform continues to do whatever it was doing before. And there's tools that evaluate what each one does and says, okay, everybody can do this. So if it's a PCL that targets everybody, there's a little tiny piece everybody can use. And then there's a long series of combinatorial combinations of different platforms that you might want to work together with. So if you wanted to do Windows Phone, I know a lot of you are Windows Phone developers, I'm sure. And it's okay to laugh. When I say you're all Windows Phone developers, you can laugh, it's okay. So you might have wanted to target something like Windows Phone and, which of course is a joke, and and .NET 4.6.1. You might have wanted some combination, and then that's a bigger set than the one that everybody implements. So the set got bigger when you had fewer things going that you were targeting, but there's a really ugly underbelly to that, which means that you write your app, and there's two platforms that you're targeting, and you have this happy application, and it's deployed in the field, and somebody's out there nodding, they know where I'm going with this. So you're in the field and you're happy and you've got two, and somebody says, you know what, that's great, but we want to now also support Xamarin. So it's no problem, right? You can just also support Xamarin. And it's like, wait a minute, now when we stick Xamarin in there, there's a bunch of APIs that we're counting on that aren't there in Xamarin. And now the PCL, I can't use it. It just blows up. I break my app. So in order to go forward to add Xamarin to the picture, you have to rewrite your app for existing applications that are already in the field. I mean, this is just like crazy talk, okay? So PCLs were a good idea at the time, the best that could be done at the time. And if you have things that target PCLs, they're still supported in a .NET Standard world. I'm not going to talk a lot about that because I think you can look for that online or email me and we'll follow up because it's kind of, I think it's a bit of a side thing. The important thing is that .NET Standard looks quite different. So since .NET Standard is just a set of rules, so the first set of rules was small, the second one was a little bigger, and a little bigger, and a little bigger, and then a lot bigger. So these look like the same size. They're not. From 1.6 to 2.0, there's about 20,000 APIs added. So it went from however small, to about 12,000 to about, I'm sorry, to, I have my number slightly wrong because I'm thinking it's 12,000 and 32,000. Yeah, this would be about 20,000 more APIs. So 1.6 was someplace around 12,000. Don't make any business decisions on those exact numbers. I want to go check them, but it's about that. It's more than doubled between 1.6 and 2.0. And what was the reason for that? It's because of you guys. It's because people that were trying to use .NET Standard said, wait a minute, I can't run my app. I have to rewrite my app because you don't support this API or that API. So Microsoft said, well, we're going to step back, and instead of just taking everybody's complaints and piecemealing this, we're going to go out across all the apps we have access to, because there are people that have told Microsoft, here, you can have my source code as long as you don't release it, because we want you to run really fast in my scenarios. There are people that have the capacity to do that. There's also a whole lot of code on NuGet. And so they went out, because you can go against an existing assembly, you don't have to have the source code, and start evaluating all the code they could get their hands on and figuring out what made sense to add to .NET Standard. So .NET Standard is not just what people yelled about. .NET Standard is actually based on evaluation of which 32,000 APIs make sense to put out there. There's a lot of thought on some of them. Some of them I think still need to evolve a little bit. There's some things in ASP.NET Core that I hope will go out across all .NET Standard within the next few years. Okay, but everything you're used to using in .NET Framework that is framework specific, not platform specific, it's a very good possibility that it's there. So it's an implementation. .NET Core is an implementation. .NET 4.61 full framework is. Xamarin is. There's a number of different .NET Standard implementation. Now, one of the things that is worth being very clear about is if you have an application on any framework, on any platform that references a .NET Standard library, it can then reference other types of libraries. So you're not like into .NET Standard and now you're stuck there. Okay, so it's not like if you create a .NET Standard library, everything downstream has to be a .NET Standard library. That would be very painful, and there's one word that describes why it would be very painful, and that's NuGet. There's tens of thousands of things on NuGet, some of which are abandoned, and there isn't anybody even who could create a standard library if they wanted to. So there's a shim that allows you to talk to .NET Full Framework. Now, is that always going to work? No, because if you go out and you hit an API that doesn't exist in .NET Standard, it's going to hit a wall. But you're going to be able to access it so you can still use your NuGet packages. So that's a really big deal, that you don't have to abandon the way you're working today to go to this world. This is binary compatibility. This was a big deal when I pushed the DLL discussion later, because I just explained how this works, right? We have a reference assembly. You like my slide. We have a reference assembly, and all that is an empty, there's no implementation, it's just an empty assembly, and that gets thrown away, and the one for the platform gets put in, and the one for the platform is responsible for doing the right thing. And what that means is getting the call to the right piece of that platform. So it's still going to run .NET 4.6 code. It's just going to go through the .NET Standard to get there. And yes, that's fast. It doesn't hurt your performance. Yeah, it's this guy over here I really like. They're all great. Okay. So now we have to have that conversation. So those of you the kids, this is like we have to have that conversation, okay? There's that conversation. And I'm sorry that we have to talk about this. Normally I would go onto the internet and I would, but this is the thing I cut short. So I clipped some things from the internet, and I'll show you how to get to those things. So figuring out the versions, and this is the version table. And if you looked at the version table for .NET Standard, if you've explored it much someplace along the line, you've seen or heard about the version table. So it actually is a valuable table. It's just like, okay, we really have to talk about this. So here's a version. There's two versions of the version table. You like that? There's a static version and a dynamic version of the version table. And there's a couple of different CSS applications, different copies of the version table that have a little bit differences. And you look at this and you go, yeah, cool, I have no idea. Because it's kind of a confusing table. This is the dynamic one, which I think can will hopefully be a good place to start here. So the idea of this table is to make clear if you decide to target a particular .NET standard. So your application says my target, I said application, that was a misspeak. What I should have said is class library, because your application has to state the platform it's running on. So these are class libraries. So the class library says it's going to target .NET Standard something. Let's say .NET Standard 2. .NET Standard 2 has a commitment from .NET Core 2.0 and above, .NET 4.6.1 and above, Mono 5.4 and above, Xamarin 10.1.4 and above, etc. So those are the versions of each platform that have committed to being on .NET Standard 2.0. Now, if you say, well, maybe I want to do 1.1. So for 1.1, and this is where all of these tables get a little confusing. They look really weird when the number gets repeated all the way across. But if there's a blank, you just go to the right until you get to the number. So if we're looking at .NET 1.1, then we have .NET Core 1.0. These numbers are so much fun, aren't they? It's like, thank goodness they really didn't call .NET Core 5. That would have really been worse. Okay, so so .NET Standard 1.1 is implemented by .NET Core 1.0 and above. It is implemented by .NET Full Framework 4.5 and above. It's implemented by Mono 4.6, Xamarin 10, Xamarin Android 7, UWP 10. Okay, so does the table make sense? Can you know, it's like, okay, that's ugly. I understand why it's like, yeah, we have to talk. Okay, so now you go, okay, but I don't really care so much about the table. What I care about, and this is how you can find it, is how am I going to decide on a version? What am I going to choose to do with this? And I can flip back to that table if it's helpful. So first of all, if you know I am targeting X, I am a full framework 4.5.1 application. I am a full framework 4.7.1 application. I know what my application is. I know my world. Everything that's going to use this class library is going to be .NET Full Framework 4.7. It's going to be .NET Core 2. It's going to be some particular thing. Just go to the table, find the right one. We don't need to have any conversation. That part's easy. Okay? Just go to what you need. If you are going to do a greenfield application, so you're starting at the beginning, then I would recommend that you use .NET Standard 2.0, and that assumes that you will be able to use the frameworks in that column because it's greenfield. So I expect you're probably going to be able to pick, and you'll be able to pick each of those platforms, work in .NET Standard 2.0, and then work with the people that are writing the application side that will call your class library to be on one of these platforms. So if it's greenfield, it makes sense to be on the latest, the greatest, the easiest, the one with the most APIs. If you're creating a library, how many of you contribute to a library that winds up on NuGet or on an internal feed that many people use, not all of whom you may ever meet? Okay, so all of you, all the people in that category, or if you're just in your organization and you expect this library to be used by people in the future and you don't know what platform they need to support, in that case, what you want to do is have the broadest reach possible. If somebody comes along and has a .NET 4.5 full framework application that wants to use your class library, you don't want to have to tell them, no, you can't do that because we arbitrarily decided it was .NET Standard 2.0, and you can't run on .NET Standard 2. You can't call a .NET Standard 2.0 library. So in that case, if all the APIs you need are available in .NET Standard 1.1, which is kind of the starting point. 1.0 is sort of like, well, they were figuring it out. So if you can target 1.1, cool, because now anyone doing a .NET full framework 4.5 application or beyond can use your class library. Same on the other platforms. It's just that's the one people are most familiar with the numbers on. Does that make sense? This is a point that I've really struggled to figure out how to explain. So if I just explained it and you got it, I'm very happy. And if I explained it so well, you're going, yeah, that was pretty easy. Why did you spend so much time on it then? Awesome. All right. So we're good? Any questions on any of that? You with me so far? Great, cool. Okay, let me see how my time is doing. I cut this thing down. I'm like, oh my gosh, if I end early, that's going to be really weird. I end in 15 minutes, correct? Is that right? Awesome. This is going to be perfect. All right. It isn't always interesting changing your talks to make them shorter, particularly when you didn't notice until 2 hours ago. So, all right. Okay. So another question people get from a technical side before I jump into what you're actually going to do with your application is, okay, what happens next? What's going to happen next? Is there never going to be another .NET Standard? That sounds terrible. I actually know the feature I want to lobby for the next version of .NET Standard. So .NET Standard, it will have another version. It will not have a patch. You can't patch something with no implementations. Does that make sense? Doesn't make sense to do a patch. I don't know what that would mean. If they figure out it means something, maybe I'll be proven wrong. But I cannot even imagine what it would mean to patch something that is a empty set of open, close brackets. You can't have bugs. Okay? What it will do is there's going to be changes to add more APIs. That's the change that we're going to want them to do. Okay? And if you got the table, it's just, let's go back to the table. It's just another column in the table. It's just that there's a 2.1 column. And when they first say, here's .NET Standard 2.1, this is what's going to be in it, or 3, I don't know where they'll go, but I'm going to give a guess. We'll get a 2.1 at some point. So guess. There'll be a new column, and it'll be empty. It'll be empty because no one will have implemented .NET Standard 2.1 because they just got it in the mail. When they get the .NET Standard 2.1, every platform will say, how can I do that? Now, in reality, there's going to be a lot of conversation and negotiation behind the scenes. So, behind the scene being on GitHub. But it's not going to be conversation that's going to be like, oh, here, you just got this in the mail. You didn't know it was coming. Surprise, surprise. It's not going to be like that. People negotiate. And so they'll be kind of ready to do it. And then each platform will have to implement that new standard in order to wind up in that new column. Does that all make sense? So it will go forward. This is an ongoing rolling thing. It's just this is our snapshot. Okay. Yeah, there we go. All right. There's not going to be another thing as big as 1.6.2 for a while. I think we'd have to have, I don't know, a huge tectonic shift in what we do for us to have a major version. That's what major versions are. It would pretty much be a major version of everything to see a .NET Standard 3. That would be huge. .NET Standard 2.1, I think we will, I hope we see. I'm sure we will see. Okay, we already did how we did that. I moved that because I thought it was helpful. Here's where I talk about the reference assemblies, PCLs, a few things. At runtime, each platform provides a .NET Standard DLL. Okay, they use binding redirects, type forwarding, type unification, none of which I'm going to talk much about except to draw a couple of pictures or to steal a couple of emails pictures to be more accurate. So your application calls a .NET Standard class library. This is the shim. Actually, it's not the shim. That's just normal .NET Standard. So your application calls a .NET Standard class library. It's just a self-contained library. It doesn't call anything else right now. It calls .NET Standard DLL to do what it needs to do, and that gets type forward back to the frameworks that are running, the framework assemblies running on that platform, whatever they are. So it can be a little more complicated if your standard class library calls into a .NET framework or portable class library. That calls into a framework assembly, goes back to .NET Standard. Remember, your application was calling all this. So this is like a subset of the previous slide. And the only takeaway I really want you to have from this is they made it work. because type forwarding and type unification is what makes it work. Type forwarding gets the message to the right place. And if you were to think about this for 20 minutes or maybe 3 minutes, you'd say, wow, the real name of that class is not just blah. It's blah with an assembly. It's got a assembly attachment. It's got a version attachment. It's got this great big huge long name internally. And you're going, wait a minute, when they start forwarding this around, how does that work? And it works from something called type unification that pulls that back together. I will warn you that because of that, there is a possibility that you will get a message that says .NET, that says type blah cannot be converted to type blah. And you go, that doesn't even make sense. Hello, you just told me it couldn't be converted to itself. That makes no sense at all. If you have those problems, then look up your specific one on the internet. For a while, there was an framework piece that you had to drop in a binding redirect on yourself. And there's been various other specific assemblies that you should be able to find on the internet have this problem. And then you can also hit the .NET Standard. If you're using .NET Standard, you can hit the GitHub with the issue because there have been a couple of problems and there's a couple of different solutions for that. That can happen. It's a side case, but if it happens, you care. There's one other place. I don't think I have actually a slide on this. There's a piece of quicksand I want to just tell you about, okay? And when I get to the end of this, I'll give you a very specific way to avoid this quicksand. Is that it turns out that implementing the .NET Standard DLL on .NET Full Framework is a little tricky because of binding redirects. Microsoft's not keeping a secret about there's challenges here. I mean, obviously we don't say, this is a huge deal. It's not. There's some side cases where a certain set of things line up that can be a problem if you switch your .NET Full Framework underneath in production. So if you're in production and you've told it you're running on 4.6.1 and all of a sudden you slide in 4.7.1, you would think that would work, and that can have a problem if there's .NET Standard involved and a few other things lined up. So there's a side case there. So if you are running .NET Standard DLLs in production against .NET Full Framework, and I'll show you a way you don't have to do that, but if you are doing that, then switching out your full framework should be something you do with a little bit of caution. If you target the framework that you actually are going to run on in production, you will be far, far safer. Okay, so these are the tools. I'm not going to show the first one. It's APIs of .NET. Somebody had to pay for that URL. That's such a cool URL. And that's a place if you say, I want to know if X is implemented on the platform. You can also go to the documentation. That's a little tedious. So if you go and you play on that, it's all the APIs, and it gives a great big long list of what is actually available, where that API is available. Okay, so you can go to that website for that. And then there's something called API Port that I'll talk about, and something like called API Analyzer that I will mention. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what you're actually going to do. Because I hope that after you heard this, you're like, I'm kind of interested in that .NET Standard thing. I want to make sure I didn't break what I'm doing, but I'm kind of interested in that because it'd be kind of cool to be able to have somebody use my library from Linux. That'd be kind of cool. So yeah, I don't want to block that, and I kind of want to be set up for the future because even though Microsoft keeps telling me that it's all good with .NET Full Framework forever, they're not going to abandon it. It still makes me a little nervous. I kind of want to be there. I want to get this stuff so I'm future-proofing myself and my applications. And that's exactly where I think that's exactly what I want you to be thinking right now, because .NET Standard is the definition of the future. So it's a cliff. Oh my gosh, it's a cliff. How do I get up the cliff? Well, let's just build some stairs. Yes, stairs, okay? Shoo, the stairs is like, we don't need like stairs theoretical, we need like real stairs, like super, like for real stairs, not like pretend stairs, like for real stairs. And we have some for real stairs. So the first thing you need to do, and this is the hardest one if you haven't already done it, which is organize your code. Oh yeah, that was that little thing. It's a web forms app and everything's in one assembly. Okay, that's gonna be a problem. You're going to have to fix that before you can use .NET Standard. But some of you have already said, okay, my business logic's here, my data logic's over there, and my UI is over there, whether it's MVC or whether it's Web API or whether it's WPF or whatever it is. I've already got it separated out. Okay? Then it's a good place to start is with that business logic. Okay? It's a great place to start looking at .NET Standard. But organizing your code, that's There's not a lot I can do to help you if you have a ways to go on that. Certainly new code you want to make sure is organized. That's what organizing your code means. Like, this was a change I made. I slipped these slides in, so that surprised me. All right, so isolate your platform-specific code from all other code, because it's the other code that you're going to be able to do. Okay, understand your current compatibility, and let's look at how to do that. So I'm going to go to, this is just a random application. It's real code, but I'm not going to show you the real code because it's a little bit irrelevant here. So it is, I will bring up, here. I've got the options up right now. I'm going to leave it up so I don't have to bring it back. So there's .NET Portability Analyzer. This is an extension for Visual Studio, which you can also run in a command line version. But if you kind of look at all these checkboxes, if you're used to using CLIs and you're used to typing things in, you're going, yeah, that's got some really ugly parameters, because it's like blah, 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 blah. So it's really hard to see what you're calling from the CLI, so we'll do exactly the same thing in Visual Studio. Plus, a lot of you are Visual Studio folks. So I've just checked a few things. I want to open Excel, and I want to check a few boxes, and that's what I want to compare with. Okay, I'll close this and just prove to you that there's code behind it. So we'll close it. And here's code. See? Code. Okay. I'm sorry. It's really irrelevant. It is a Web API app. It is an ASP.NET Core Web API app. Okay? I'm going to go to Solution, and because this extension's there, I have two options right here. To look at the settings you just saw, and to analyze. If I click Analyze, it'll and create an Excel spreadsheet. And if I've already opened the Excel spreadsheet and lined up all the columns so you can see it, it will go a lot better. So I did that. Oh no, where is it? Oh, there it is. Whew. Oh, you don't want to see that. You want to see this? Okay, yay! Okay. So this is a application I wrote for an entirely different reason. This application was written to show some pieces about how you can do C# functional techniques, higher order function stuff. That's the whole purpose behind this app. It had nothing to do with this. It is an ASP.NET Core app out of convenience. It's fairly small. It doesn't do a lot of things. But I asked folks in a workshop that I was in, the reason I'm late, is I was in a workshop yesterday, and I said, just run this on your code. People going, it works. I got 100%. Yes! There's a very high probability that if you run this on your business, on your the business layer of your application, it's just going to say 100%. It's not going to be too unlikely in the columns you care about. So let's look at what these columns are. Okay, so the only change I made to the it doesn't work. I hate that. Okay, look up at the top where it says Core on line 4. Okay, Core 1.0. That doesn't appear on yours. I typed that in. I typed that in because the one annoying thing about this spreadsheet is it says .NET Core blah blah version 1.0, and so all of the thing you care about, the number, is like way out to the right, and you have to spread them out, and then you couldn't see it, and I hated that. So I just wrote, I just put that up there. All I did is I typed that in. So I can say, hey, cool, look, I can, in my domain, which is just one of my libraries, I can go to .NET Core right now, no problem. 1.0, 2.0, no problem, okay? I got a couple issues with full framework. I got to go figure out what that is. And I'm going to have to look and see what that 91.3 is on 4.7.1. That is a standard library right now, so I hope it runs in standard. The specs are not. The specs are an XUnit project. Okay, I can spend some time on that. Wait a minute, what happens with Web API? 50%, I'm never going to move that. That's going to be a huge mess. Can you imagine moving it when you had like all those problems? Of all the APIs I'm calling, 50% of the APIs I'm calling are not there. Oops. Well, it's a ASP.NET Core project. It's very platform specific. It's not intended to move. That's my entry point. That's not supposed to move. So it's no big deal that those numbers just stink. Okay? So then you say, wait a minute, but there's some number in here that I want to explore further. And then you go to the details. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this except to zoom in a little bit to show you that up here we have a type, and then we have a member, so we can figure out what we're looking at. And you can just note that that's logging and configuration. And then we can come over here and say, not supported, use something. Oh, I made a bunch of things go away, I guess. Yes, I made a bunch of things go away. I've gone down to .NET Standard version 2. And it's .NET Standard version 2. And I can see what I'm doing that's causing a problem, and what I'm doing is I'm using the configuration and logging, which are, I said I already know what I want to ask for .NET Standard 2.1. And I think we probably could use a consistent configuration story that is going to work with ASP.NET Core. And at least the way I implemented this, and I haven't explored it further, then that did not work when I tried to use the configuration for my XUnit project and my ASP.NET Core project. I ran into some issues. And then Web API, I don't care about that. But that is the logger, and that's the reason that I care, is just that iLogger, Microsoft.extensions.ilogger, which is a beautiful piece of logging work. It's based on Serolog. It's very good, and that is only in ASP.NET Core right now, not in .NET Standard. Okay? So this is just a random application, like in 3 or 4 minutes, this is how you go about looking at it. So I hope you look at that and you go, wow, I could do that to my application. Okay, so you do that, and now you understand your compatibility. And I go small again so I can find where I'm at. And I go back here, and I say, great, okay, so you understand your compatibility. These are the tools. There's tools. Okay, so earlier I told you what the two tools are. The next thing after that is you make sure that first you spike, and you make sure you're going good, and you make sure you're testing, and you make sure your performance is good as well, as that you actually can run and you don't blow up on your build. So you just kind of play with this a bit, make sure Visual Studio, there's certain scenarios right now, there's another update coming that you might be a little bit slow. Make sure that you don't have anything that's just causing any issues in your world. Just play with it a little bit. You should do that with any new technology. I'm not saying that there's like big, bad, awful stuff. I'm saying that you should always walk into new technology carefully. Okay, and that's just some stuff about that mentions that there's this little 461, 471 thing. And then you should ensure ongoing compatibility. You get there, okay? And now just make sure that you stay there. And that's the second tool that it was on the earlier slide, which is an analyzer. And it's going to help you know if you do something that's not available on a different platform. For example, you're used to saying console.writeLine. It's much less likely you say console.windowWidth. I think it's that. It's similar to that. Window width, window something. Well, that's not available in Linux. Okay, so you're not going to be able to use that API. Well, this analyzer will show you that. And then finally go to standard when and where you need it. So there's no reason you can easily target multiple platforms, standard and full framework 461. You can target multiple things. And as you do that, you'll know that you're still compiling and working against .NET Standard, but you can still deploy to the field .NET 4.6.1 or 4.7.1 or 4.5.1 or whatever it is that you're currently deploying to the field. You can continue to deploy that. You don't have to make the big jump off the cliff and change your production immediately. You can do it in steps. So .NET Standard is worth going to just as a way to be able to say to yourself, hey, I know how to go to the future. To say to your boss, somebody walks in the door and says, hey, we're going to start doing Xamarin stuff. And you're going to say, okay, a lot of our stuff's ready to go. It's still going to be a lot of work, but we know where we sit, got no idea, got to go study Xamarin. Because you're going to know that your business side of it will go because .NET Standard and Xamarin both will work together. Now, there's one more little thing in that. When I say that, I do want to point out that .NET Standard does touch on some things that will not work on certain frameworks. They did not say, like, if there's any place it's not going to work, we're not going to include it. So you can, and you can find more about the particular APIs and where they break. It's going to be a dozen of them maybe. So they're going to get to be pretty well known. Where it won't work or it needs to work differently on a platform. Something like, the Windows with maybe you just can't do anything about, but there's things like around the registry where you need to just do it a little bit differently on Linux because Linux doesn't have a registry. Okay, so the point is, you can do this. We can go into the future together. And I just like showing off a picture of my 2 beautiful sons, both of whom, the one on the left got a job at Google this week. So I'm quite excited about that. And so that is the end of what I'm going to say today, unless you guys have some questions. Any questions? Guys? Yes? If you're trying to share a class library with multiple people, then targeting the lowest version of the standard that has the APIs you need will allow the most platforms to be available. Yes?
Figure out which version of the standard that is. What's the best way to figure out which version? Is it the analyzer?
That is going to be the table.
We need questions after. We're out of time.
We're out of time. They're going to turn me off. Okay. It's going to be wherever the table is. It's going to be the table.
Thank you.
Okay.